So I've sold out. I've resorted to doing one of the easiest form of content on YouTube, which is doing like a quarterly Q&A session of sorts. And of course, there isn't really much research needed to be done because ultimately the format of the video is just me answering some of the questions that you have posted on my community chat or even just on my Discord server itself. So I apologize in advance, but of course, I would like to extend my gratitude and thanks to all of you who actually asked me questions on all these different platforms and avenues. And it really allowed me to sit down and think through some of these questions and how things have been playing out over the last few months, and whether there was any change in my outlook, whether is there any change in my projections for all my investment, and particularly Alibaba stock. So with that in mind, of course, if you would like to indulge in this entire video of me just being narcissistic and trying to think that I'm important enough for people to understand my opinion, then please feel free to continue watching the video. And I think a lot of these questions are actually quite pertinent in terms of the developments and in terms of how things have been playing out in China. So the first question from Andrew. If you didn't buy Alibaba, what stock or business would you base your channel on? So I believe that it's a common perception that, hey, Tay Chee Keng equates to Alibaba, because essentially speaking, most, if not all of my video is covering surrounding only one stock particularly. And of course I understand there are a lot of other creators out there in the entire YouTube universe. There are people covering US equities, there are people covering large cap, mid cap, or some just talk about growth stocks, or some just talk about value investing, etc, etc. And many of them have been doing a very spectacular job in terms of their research, in terms of their knowledge, and how they want to distill pertinent and critical points to a lot of all you investors out there who are using YouTube as a platform to do your research. But I would just like to say that as all things in life, there are different strategies on YouTube as well. There are people that focus on one particular company. So an example off the top of my head would be a few channels which have a core focus on Tesla. So for example, people like Chicken Genius Singapore, Dave Lee on investing, solving the money problem, etc. So they have a primary focus on Tesla. And there are also people that focuses on the Chinese equities market. There are also people that focuses on Palantir, for example. So there are a whole suite of different choices on YouTube. And you as a consumer or you as a viewer really do have the autonomy to try to distill who are the good ones, who are the bad ones, and who do you ultimately want to follow. But back to the question, if I were to restart again, or if I were to really just look back and think back again, I would actually not want to focus on one particular stock, because it really limits your scope and it really limits your potential in reaching to more audience. Because ultimately you have to understand, even though some of you are huge Alibaba bulls, there are people that hate Alibaba to its core. And for those type of viewers, they are not interested, even though they might be interested in Chinese equities by and large. Maybe they might like JD, they might like Meituan, they might like Tencent, for example. So by being focused, there are definitely pros and cons to each strategy. I would actually like to talk more about the entire Chinese equities market by and large. Because as we all know, we are all naturally gifted with some forms of unfair advantage. And to be very frank, one of my unfair advantage is being bilingual. And I wouldn't say that I'm best in both English and Chinese, but I do believe that I have a decent grasp and a decent command of both English and Chinese. And it allowed me to have a more nuanced perspective when judging news medias, for example. So I really felt that some of the issues playing out in China, it's a little bit overblown, but I wouldn't say that they are totally without merits. I would really like to consider the facts, I would like to consider the different opinions put in place, but I wouldn't be so quick to come up with a judgment and be so quick to believe in all the headlines, because you all know people in the media industry always like to go for clickbaits. So as you all know, everyone has their own motives and we have to be very cognizant about where they're coming from. And to answer the question, I would not want to focus on a particular stock or a particular business, but I would just like to look into China by and large and really look into some of the more interesting companies. So with that said, the entire focus of the channel will still stay grounded in Alibaba, but I would like to shift a little bit more attention back into the Chinese equities market by and large, and not just focus on Alibaba per se. And of course, it also depends on my bandwidth and how much time do I have on my hands. So next, question from Gigi. Thoughts on the Chinese internet sector as a whole versus Alibaba, example KWEB. So to make it quick and dirty, through my own research, of course it's not all encompassing, and of course I am not Google essentially, so I do not have all the research off the top of my head, but essentially speaking, the entire Chinese internet sector has been reformed for the better. If you were to really understand what the CCP has been cracking down on and what they have been trying to do, the entire narrative and the entire focus that they have been trying to push across and the agenda of the entire government has always been putting their people at the central of whatever they've been doing. About all these different narratives like common prosperity, deleveraging, sustainable growth in the long term. I think a lot of all these are key pillars in how CCP has been always trying to derive and trying to drive their outcomes. And they've largely remained unchanged. So with that in mind, even though there's been this intensified crackdown on all this entire internet sector, as long as you buy into the entire strategy, I don't see a very big issue in the medium to long term. Of course, there's definitely a lot of pain in the short term because a lot of people are trying to understand and trying to internalize what they're trying to do. But actually, I think I'm in the same camp as Ray Dalio. Don't mistake all these different crackdowns and don't mistake all these different regulatory clampdowns as a signal towards going back to communism. I think there's been a lot of congruency in how the entire government comes together and fixate their vision on something that is quite commendable. And if you were to really want to compare Alibaba versus the entire Chinese internet sector, for those of you who just want to participate in the Chinese equities markets movement, especially in the tech sector, I would honestly ask you to try to just buy into an ETF, which is KWEB in this case. And for those of you who are extremely bullish in Alibaba because you think that it's undervalued, because you think that the entire fear-mongering climate surrounding the company is not warranted, please feel free to do so, but please do your own due diligence and please do your own research. Because borrowed conviction don't last. Please understand why you even bought into Alibaba in the first place and not just based off some random guy on the internet like a random YouTuber say that because Alibaba is a buy, that's why it's a buy. And I think why Alibaba has been suffering such a huge loss or has been plummeting down so spectacularly was also because Alibaba is essentially the face of this entire crackdown. As you can see, regardless of what kind of article they read, regardless of whether is it from Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, CNBC, every single article surrounding the entire tech clampdown will all talk about the stopping of an IPO, which is also why I think subconsciously a lot of investors think that, hey, it's a personal vendetta against Chairman Xi and Jack Ma in this case. But I really think that's very far from the truth. But yeah, you can believe whatever you want to believe. Next, a question from, I'm not going to say his name because it's essentially a vulgarity. But anyway, what do you think Baba's stock price will be in 2 to 3 years from now? Does China's regulatory crackdown has material impact on Baba's business fundamental? I think we are still in a very dynamic situation right now. There's still a good 3 months or at least a quarter before this theoretical clampdown will stop, or at least the pace of the crackdown will slow down. And it remains dynamic, and a lot of all these developments are work in progress. A lot of things have been mentioned. For example, the regulators are talking about data privacy issue, talking about how the algorithm will have to limit to some sort of guidelines and some sort of restrictions. But of course, they are also open to opinions, and there was also deadlines given about how the different stakeholders can complain or can issue their own opinions and their own viewpoints to the government for them to recalibrate this entire new regulations and new guidelines. So these different guidelines and regulations remain a work in progress. I will try to do up some sort of timeline or some sort of impact analysis on how far all these different regulatory crackdowns or how far this sort of guidelines will affect the business materially. So that's one part. On the second part, what do you think Alibaba's stock price will be in 2 to 3 years from now? I touched my heart. And in order for me to give you a very honest opinion, I'll give you 3 words. I don't know. So if that's not a good enough answer, I'll definitely follow up with another video on explaining why I hate giving short-term price predictions. And of course, you might say that, hey, 2 to 3 years is not really a very short time frame. And if that's the case, I'll just postulate that, hey, Alibaba will go back to its intrinsic value. Next, a question from Nimrod. How to deal and comprehend the VIE structure and ADR structure? It's super complicated to me. I acknowledge the fact that, hey, the entire VIE structure is extremely complicated. Even people in the law profession knows that it's an extremely complicated design. So I think I'll explain why am I comfortable even investing in a VIE structure on 2 folds. Firstly, it's about the start goal of a VIE, and secondly, the end goal of a VIE. So speaking about the start goal, I'm not going to give you a huge history lesson because it will ultimately drag into an entire documentary. But honestly speaking, as I said earlier, the entire VIE structure was created or invented to circumvent some of these problems that the Chinese government is extremely uncomfortable with all these different foreign influence and foreign pressure on all these different companies. And more importantly, unfriendly foreign forces or unfriendly foreign influence. They are just extremely afraid of their local companies, especially big companies like Alibaba, JD, Meituan, where all these companies operate in a VIE structure, when a lot of all this foreign capital and foreign superpowers to be listening to their bidding. But I think if you were to really put yourself in the Chinese government's shoe, I don't think it's very hard to understand why they don't want all these different foreign forces to be dabbling in their own internal affairs and their own internal economy. They haven't been doing a very good job in terms of interfering with foreign governance. I'm not going to mention names, but I believe a lot of you are extremely well read. Most of you follow the news on a daily or weekly basis. You can see that there's a huge track record on how disastrous and how chaotic when one sovereign country intends to try to meddle into another sovereign country's internal affairs, internal governance, internal stock market, internal economy. So I'm not going to push forward this entire argument. I'm just going to say that I understand why the Chinese government dislike this kind of influence being infiltrated into the entire economy itself. So this is just the start goal. The start goal of the VIE is to prevent them from having the final say and to protect the Chinese government's final say in how they want to govern the country. And the end goal, which is, I think a lot of issues and a lot of problems surrounding this entire VIE structure is that they are afraid that the Chinese government will invalidate the entire structure, essentially siphoning, or if, for example, right now, Alibaba has a $400 billion market cap. Overnight, if they say that they invalidate the entire VIE structure, $400 billion worth of equity will vanish and it will just disappear. Or in this case, who's going to foot the bill? Essentially, all of us foreign investors invested in this VIE structure. Let's really look at it from a very objective and a very logical viewpoint. To what extent or how triggered the Chinese government will have to be in order for them to invalidate the entire VIE structure? And you have to also consider the repercussions behind invalidating it. The loss of confidence, this stopping of capital flow and this exchange in foreign capital will essentially stifle the entire Chinese economy. Of course, I'm not saying that there isn't such a probability. China might want to go back and they might want to become North Korea and just lock themselves up again. I'm not saying that this will not happen, but just think about how ridiculous it will sound and what's motivating them to do that. They want to stay in their fortress, they want to stay in their walled garden, and I don't know, just to feel good about themselves. I think being a global superpower would make them feel better of themselves, to be honest. But yeah, that's just my own viewpoint. So I hope I did kind of answer your VIE structure problem. Next, a question from Sherming. How do you feel about the amount of stocks in your portfolio? What is the right amount? It's always the age-old question of diversification versus concentration. And when are you stopping with buying Alibaba? The first question, I think if you really want to talk about the diversification versus concentration argument, you can take a look at this video. I'll put a thumbnail here. I think I did discuss about that entire concept extensively in that video particularly. And on point 2, when am I stopping? I think a fundamental investment philosophy is really to buy a great company at a decent valuation. And when would I stop buying Alibaba? When I think that the valuation already meets its minimum intrinsic value and I'm uncomfortable adding more position, or if I'm uncomfortable having more exposure. And as you all might know, all of us would have cash flow coming in, month out. And in that case, if I do have spare cash and I think that the valuation of Alibaba remains relatively attractive and there are nothing much going on in the entire market, like Apple is still trading at 140, 150, unless there's a case where Apple suddenly starts trading at $100, where I feel that there's a better opportunity, I will probably start buying other stocks if I see such kind of deals in the market. If not, I'll just continue buying Alibaba, because in this case, my entire thesis didn't change. The valuation didn't change. It even got better. So why am I stopping my buying? And last but not least, I think there was one quote floating around that I saw recently. Why would you buy your second best stock when your first best stock is still trading at such a cheap and attractive valuation? Of course, taking into account your own exposure and your own risk profile. But yes, I will buy until I don't feel like buying. And the last question from Full Court Press. What are your long-term goals? Example, are you investing for financial independence? Or do you have larger goals in sight, such as running a fund? That's a very good and interesting question. I do not really have a very long-term goal. Honestly speaking, I think a lot of you that are investing right now have a common goal, which is to achieve financial independence. And achieving financial independence doesn't mean you have to go and buy the Lamborghini, or doesn't mean you have to buy a landed property. I think the entire focus of having a financial independent life is the ability for you to have the freedom to do whatever the heck you want. Not having the worry of needing to pay your bill next month, not having the worry that you'll lose your job, etc., etc. Of course, everybody is striving for financial independence. But for me particularly, honestly speaking, because I'm leading an extremely carefree life, I think ultimately I'm kind of living in the present moment. I really just want to kind of enjoy what I'm doing, and most importantly, really living a life without much regrets on my deathbed. I guess that's my minimum commitment to myself, and I don't want to look back and say that, hey, I have this opportunity, why did I not take it? Or hey, I could have done so much more with my life. I think that's a very sad thing to do, and a very sad thing to ponder upon when you are breathing your last breath. I guess that's how I put it. But of course, I understand a lot of y'all invest to get a passive income, to build a portfolio big enough so that you can survive off dividends or survive off the annual capital appreciation. And yeah, there's a lot of discussions and commotion surrounding the FIRE movement, the 4% rule, how much you need to retire, etc., etc. I totally buy into all these different concepts, but I think as of now, I'm really kind of just enjoying the process, trying to improve my craft, trying to make myself more interesting. And I don't know, man, I'm probably not in it for the fame, or I'm not in it for the clout, but I really enjoy being genuine, being myself in front of the camera, and really just talking trash. And for those of you who actually find value in terms of what I've been sharing and what I've been researching, I think that's the best of both worlds. So with that in mind, I'll see you in the next video, but more importantly, I'll see you on the moon. Goodbye!